The hallways of Lincoln High gleamed with the kind of polish only money could buy, marble tiles, glass walls, and chandeliers that looked more fitting for a five-star hotel than a school. Beneath that glitter, however, was a culture far less refined, a hierarchy built not on talent or effort, but on wealth, lineage, and appearances. Elijah Turner stood at the bottom of that social pyramid the very moment he walked through the gates. Dressed in worn sneakers, pants that hovered above his ankles, and a faded blue shirt that had seen better days, he didn't need to say a word to be judged. His skin, his clothes, and the backpack patched up at least 3 times spoke volumes. And at Lincoln High, appearances were louder than reality. Elijah had earned his spot not through family connections, but through raw talent, a scholarship given to underprivileged students with exceptional artistic abilities. For Elijah, that meant the piano. His grandmother, Marta, had raised him on classical music, jazz, and gospel melodies since he was a toddler. The old, yellow-keyed piano in their Eastwood home had been his refuge for years. But here at this school no one cared about how he played. They saw only what they wanted to see, a charity case. The scorn was immediate. The first whisper came before his first class even started. "Where'd he crawl out from, Eastwood?" someone sneered. "He looks like a beggar," another voice chuckled. Connor Mason, the golden-haired son of a luxury steakhouse mogul, led the mockery like a maestro conducting an orchestra of cruelty. Elijah tried to ignore them, keeping his eyes down and his hands clutching the frayed straps of his backpack. He sat in the back always. Teachers barely acknowledged him. Mr. Stevenson, known for his discipline, skipped over Elijah's desk every time he did a row check. He didn't get called on. He didn't get asked how he was doing. It was as though he was a ghost, drifting through the gleaming corridors of privilege. But the worst blow came on a Thursday afternoon when Principal Whitaker appeared in front of his class. "Elijah Turner," he said loud enough for everyone to hear. "Come to my office." Murmurs filled the air as Elijah packed his notebook and followed the principal down the corridor. Whitaker was a tall, silver-haired man with a voice like honey but eyes that gave away a different flavor, cold, assessing, ruthless. "Do you play any instruments?" Whitaker asked once the door to his office closed behind them. Elijah hesitated. "Yes, sir. I play the piano." "The piano?" Whitaker raised an eyebrow. "Interesting." That was all. No further questions. No expressions of interest. Just that word, interesting, uttered with a smile that felt more like a smirk. Elijah walked back to class uneasy, suspecting something was coming but not knowing what. The announcement came the very next day. The school's annual talent show was scheduled for the following week. And as a special request by Principal Whitaker himself, the opening performance would be a piano solo by Elijah Turner. The class burst into laughter. Connor clapped mockingly. "This is going to be the best comedy act ever." Elijah's face burned. His heart thudded in his chest like it wanted to escape. He understood it now. Whitaker hadn't chosen him out of admiration but amusement. He would be the punchline to a cruel joke, the warm-up act to a night of privilege parading as culture. That night, Elijah didn't sleep. Lying on his narrow bed, he stared at the cracked ceiling of the small house he shared with Grandma Marta. He thought about telling the principal no. He thought about pretending to be sick. He thought about transferring schools or disappearing entirely. Then he heard it, the faint, off-key jingle of the old piano in the basement. Marta had started playing. She wasn't skilled, but every note she struck was filled with love. Elijah sat up. He walked down the creaky steps and saw her there in her old robe, gently pressing keys. She looked up and smiled. "Play something for me," she said softly. He sat beside her and began. The music came slow at first but then faster, stronger. His fingers flew, pouring out the anger, the shame, the humiliation. And when the last note faded, Marta took his hand and said, "When you play, Elijah, the world stops and listens. Let them hear you." In that moment, a decision was made. He would go on that stage. Not to entertain them. Not to be their joke. But to silence them. The next morning, Elijah walked into school with a calmness that even he didn't quite understand. The whispers followed him like shadows. Some mocking, some curious, but all expecting a disaster. He took his seat at the back as usual, but something was different. His shoulders were a bit straighter. His gaze more focused. Connor made his usual rounds of sarcasm. "Hey maestro, practicing for the big show? Don't forget to wear your best trash bag tux." The class laughed. But Elijah didn't flinch. He didn't even look up. His silence unnerved them more than any comeback could. After classes he didn't linger. He rushed home, skipped dinner, and went straight to the old basement. The piano waited like an old friend, chipped, off-pitch and full of soul. 4 hours Elijah played. He didn't just practice pieces, he poured himself into them. Each note became a brushstroke painting his story: the loss of his mother, the absence of a father, the quiet strength of his grandmother, the sting of isolation, the bitterness of being made invisible. Above him, Marta worked in the kitchen, pausing often to listen. Her eyes would glisten, but she never interrupted. She knew this was sacred. Meanwhile, at Lincoln High, Principal Whitaker's plan was unfolding as expected. He'd subtly planted the seed among certain students that Elijah's performance would be memorable, with just enough sarcasm in his tone to make them anticipate a train wreck. He met privately with a few wealthy parents under the pretense of maintaining standards. What he didn't say aloud, but what everyone understood, was that this scholarship student was about to be put in his place. But there were things Whitaker didn't count on. Miss Kendrick, the school's music teacher, had been watching. She hadn't said much during Elijah's first weeks. Like others, she had observed from a distance, cautious not to draw attention to the boy who was clearly being singled out. But she'd seen the change, the fire that had ignited behind Elijah's quiet eyes. And she'd heard whispers of his playing, stories passed between students who'd accidentally caught a few notes through the old auditorium doors. So one afternoon Miss Kendrick approached him after class. "Elijah," she said gently, "I'd like to hear you play." He hesitated, unsure if this was another trap. But her eyes were sincere, her posture relaxed. Slowly, he nodded and followed her to the music room. The grand piano stood in the center like a sleeping dragon. Elijah sat down, took a breath, and began. The music was raw, unpolished in places, but alive. When he finished, the silence was so complete it rang in his ears. Miss Kendrick simply whispered, "They have no idea what's coming." From that day forward, she helped him, quietly behind the scenes. She gave him better sheet music, helped him polish his transitions, and most importantly, reminded him that his gift wasn't something to hide. It was his strength. As the talent show drew nearer, the energy at Lincoln High shifted. Posters went up, rehearsals filled the hallways with music and dance. But the biggest buzz was still around Elijah's performance. Students were planning to record it, some out of curiosity, others out of malice. Connor had even joked about live-streaming it for a laugh. Elijah's debut, Symphony for Garbage Shoes, he mocked one day during lunch, sending his table into hysterics. But this time a few students didn't laugh. Some exchanged uncertain glances. A few even looked guilty. Because beneath the surface something was shifting. Word had spread of his playing. A few curious students had wandered by the music room and left stunned. They'd heard not just talent, but pain, beauty, and power wrapped into one voice. A voice they hadn't expected from the quiet black boy in the corner. And Elijah felt it too. Not acceptance, not yet, but a crack in the wall. A sliver of space where his truth could breathe. The night before the show, Elijah sat at the piano for hours. He didn't rehearse the piece again, he already knew every note by heart. Instead he played for his grandmother. No words. Just music. Marta sat beside him with a cup of tea, her hand resting lightly on his shoulder. When he finished, she looked at him, her voice steady despite the tears in her eyes. "Whatever happens tomorrow," she said, "remember, you've already won." The sun rose soft and golden on the morning of the performance, but at Lincoln High, tension buzzed through the air like static before a storm. Students poured into the hall in designer jackets and polished shoes, murmuring and laughing, some still mocking, others genuinely intrigued. They were all there for the show, but many of them deep down were there for the moment, the one where they expected Elijah Turner to crash and burn in front of the entire school. In the front row, Connor leaned back with smug anticipation. His phone was already set up on a small tripod. The live stream was ready. The title read, "Piano Fail, Trust Me You'll Cry Laughing." Behind the curtain, Elijah stood still, hands folded, head bowed, not in fear but in focus. He could hear the murmurs, feel the eyes. His stomach churned, but his spine stayed straight. He reached into his pocket and felt the folded paper his grandmother had slipped into his jacket that morning. 4 words, handwritten in elegant, looping script. "Let them hear you." From the wings, Miss Kendrick gave him a nod. No words. Just a look that said, "You're ready?" Then came the announcement. "And now, opening this year's talent showcase, please welcome Elijah Turner." There was a moment of scattered applause, polite but thin, mixed with the unmistakable sound of stifled laughter. The air was thick with expectation, not of awe but of entertainment at someone else's expense. Elijah stepped out onto the stage. The lights blinded him for a second. The auditorium stretched before him, a sea of silhouettes, eyes blinking with curiosity, cameras already rolling. He walked to the grand piano, gleaming black and pristine. It wasn't like the battered one in his basement, but the keys were the same. Music didn't care about polish. He sat, closed his eyes, breathed, and then he played. The first note echoed like a drop of water in still air. Then another. Then another. Within seconds the sound swelled, alive and magnetic. His fingers moved with purpose, weaving a story that no words could tell, a story of pain, of long nights in a basement, of cold stares and whispered mockery, of love and loss and fierce, burning pride. The room fell silent. Phones lowered. Jaws slackened. Even Connor, mid-sneer, forgot to hit record. Each note carried emotion so real it wrapped itself around the audience's hearts and refused to let go. His fingers danced, trembled, stormed, and soared. The music was more than a performance. It was a declaration. I am here. I am more than you see. I'm not your joke. The final chords came like thunder crashing into waves, then softened to a single aching note that hung in the air, fragile and full. When it ended, Elijah lifted his hands, breath shallow, heart pounding. He didn't look up right away. He didn't need to. The silence said enough. Then applause. Slow at first. From somewhere near the back. Then another. And another. Then a roar. The whole auditorium erupted into thunderous clapping, standing, cheering. Students who had never spoken to Elijah now looked at him with awe. Teachers who hadn't known his name now whispered it with reverence. And in the front row Marta stood. Tears streamed down her cheeks as she clapped, her hands shaking but her gaze steady. Elijah's eyes found hers, and for a moment, nothing else mattered. He stood, bowed, and walked off stage with his head held high. Backstage, Miss Kendrick met him with misty eyes and a tight hug. You didn't just play, Elijah, she whispered. You rewrote the story. But not everyone was applauding. Behind the curtain, Principal Whitaker stood frozen. His expression, once smug, had soured into something else, tight-lipped, pale, and tense. His plan had failed spectacularly. The boy he had handpicked to humiliate had turned his entire school into witnesses to his own greatness. And worse, he had done it without permission. Elijah didn't see Whitaker as he left the stage. But if he had, he would have seen a man staring not just at a student, but at the beginning of the end. Because now the walls were cracking. And the truth had a soundtrack no one could ignore. The echoes of Elijah's performance didn't fade with the final note. They lingered, in whispers, in glances, in the sudden hush that followed him through the hallways. Lincoln High, so used to its shiny surfaces and shallow judgment, had been shaken. And at the center of that tremor was the boy they once ignored, now impossible to forget. The next day, Elijah walked into school, and for the first time, the stares that met him weren't hostile or mocking. They were curious, reverent even. Some students gave small nods as he passed. Others smiled awkwardly, as if realizing for the first time he was human. A few brave ones murmured compliments under their breath. Connor, once the ringleader of ridicule, didn't say a word. He sat at his desk, eyes averted. His smugness deflated. Even the teachers seemed different. Mr. Stevenson, who had rarely looked in Elijah's direction, paused by his desk that morning and gave a clipped but sincere, impressive work yesterday. It wasn't just the performance that had stunned the school, it was the clarity with which it destroyed the expectations surrounding it. 4 days they had expected a punchline. What they got was poetry. But beneath the surface, not everyone celebrated. Principal Whitaker sat alone in his office, staring at the performance footage someone had emailed him. He replayed it 3 times. Not because he enjoyed it, but because he needed to understand how everything had gone so wrong. This wasn't just a boy playing piano. This was power. The kind of power that made people rethink what they believed. The kind that threatened the very foundation Whitaker had so carefully built at Lincoln High, an invisible but rigid caste system, where the wealthy thrived and the others served as cautionary tales. And now, Elijah had upended it in 6 minutes. Whitaker knew he had underestimated him. But it wasn't too late. Power didn't fall apart from one standing ovation. Or so he thought. Later that afternoon, Whitaker summoned Elijah to his office. The moment Elijah stepped inside, the air grew thick with unspoken tension. Whitaker's usual warm facade had been replaced with a mask of controlled coldness. "Take a seat," he said, gesturing to the stiff leather chair across from his desk. Elijah sat, posture straight, heart steady. Whitaker didn't speak right away. He folded his hands, leaned forward, and said, "That was quite a performance." "Thank you," Elijah replied evenly. The principal's lips curled in what might have been a smile, but never reached his eyes. "I must say you surprised us all. You're obviously more talented than anyone anticipated. His tone dripped with condescension, each word chosen with care to avoid admitting fault. Elijah nodded. I just did what I love. And love is wonderful, Whitaker said smoothly. But let's not confuse passion with permission. Elijah blinked. I'm not sure I understand. Whitaker stood, walked to the window, and looked out over the schoolyard like a king surveying his realm. You see, Elijah, Lincoln High has a reputation. One built carefully over many years. Excellence, order, tradition. Your little performance, while impressive, has stirred things up. Perhaps more than you realize. Elijah sat still, silent, but inside his gut tightened. He knew where this was going. I hope you don't intend to let this attention distract you, Whitaker continued, turning back. We can't have students letting success go to their heads, especially when they come from challenging backgrounds. There it was. The mask slipping. Elijah's voice came out calm but unflinching. With respect, sir, I think it's more distracting to keep students from believing they belong. Whitaker's smile vanished. Watch yourself, Turner. Elijah stood. I always have. He left the office without another word, leaving Whitaker behind, seething. For the first time in a long time, the principal had been challenged, not by a teacher, not by a parent, but by a student he once dismissed as nothing. Back in the music room, Elijah found Miss Kendrick waiting. She had heard about the meeting and didn't need an explanation. She could see it in his eyes. He's scared of you, she said simply. He should be, Elijah replied. Miss Kendrick smiled. That night, Elijah sat at the old piano in the basement, his fingers finding familiar keys. Marta sat nearby, her knitting in hand, but her eyes never left him. You've started something, she said. I know. Good. Now finish it. And with those words, a new idea began to form. A vision not just for himself, but for every student like him who had ever been silenced, overlooked, or used as a joke. Lincoln High was about to change again. But this time it would be no accident. Change often begins quietly, but at Lincoln High, it started with a crescendo. After Elijah's performance, the ripple he had created began turning into waves. Miss Kendrick, now emboldened, had seen enough of the school's hidden injustices. For years she had stayed silent, her voice muffled beneath the weight of protocol and intimidation. But watching Elijah, watching him rise with dignity in a space designed to humiliate him, ignited something deeper than admiration. It awakened purpose. One Monday afternoon she called Elijah into the music room after class. He entered cautiously, but her warm smile calmed his nerves. I've been thinking, she said, motioning for him to sit. That performance wasn't just a moment, Elijah. It was a spark. And I believe we need to build something from it. He looked at her, curious. I want to start a new music program. A school-wide event. Open to everyone, no limits, no filters. A space for students to share their stories, their talents, without judgment. Elijah's eyes lit up. You mean, like a show? More than a show, she replied. A movement. A message. We'll call it Voces da Escola, Voices of the School. And I want you to help me lead it. It was a lot to take in, but Elijah felt something shift inside him. This wasn't just about him anymore. It was about Miguel, the quiet math genius forced into the background. About Jenny Lee, the gifted writer who never got a single story published in the school journal. It was about every student who had ever been made to feel less than. I'm in, Elijah said without hesitation. And so it began. The very next week, Miss Kendrick and Elijah held their first meeting in the music room. At first, only a handful of students showed up, Miguel among them, sitting in the corner, arms crossed, uncertain. Jenny came too, notebook in hand but eyes wary. But something in Elijah's calm confidence made them stay. We're not just performing, Elijah told the small group. We're telling our truth. Word began to spread. By the second week, 20 students filled the room. By the third, they had to move to the auditorium. Each meeting brought more stories. A dancer who choreographed alone in her bedroom because she couldn't afford classes. A spoken-word poet whose father laughed every time she wrote. A violinist who had been told his accent was too distracting to ever make it. Each story cracked the foundation Whitaker had so carefully built. The principal, of course, noticed, and he was not pleased. He called Kendrick into his office, shut the door, and sat behind his desk like a judge preparing for sentencing. I understand you've started some extracurricular activity. Kendrick didn't flinch. It's called Voces da Escola. The students are responding well. Whitaker's smile was thin. This school has always supported the arts. But not when they become political statements. It's not political, Kendrick said evenly. It's honest, and it's necessary. You're walking a fine line. She stood, not waiting to be dismissed. Then I suggest you draw a better one. Whitaker watched her go, fury boiling beneath his composed exterior. He couldn't shut it down, not yet. Not without causing a scene. But he could apply pressure in other ways. That week, the school mysteriously lost the funding for Kendrick's music department. Posters advertising the event were torn down. Students were warned by their homeroom teachers that participation in unauthorized gatherings could reflect poorly on their records. But the movement didn't shrink. It grew. Students met anyway, in classrooms, in the courtyard, online. They recorded videos, wrote music, shared poetry. Elijah became the face of the program not because he wanted to, but because the students needed him to be. Even Marta noticed the change. You walk taller these days, she said one night as he practiced. I'm not just walking for me anymore, he replied, playing a hopeful chord. Meanwhile, Whitaker doubled down. He called parents of students involved, expressing concern over their academic focus. He hinted to school board members that Kendrick was radicalizing the student body. He even tried to introduce a new policy requiring prior approval for all student performances. But the students pushed back. And for the first time, parents joined them. A mother stood up during a PTA meeting and asked, "Why is my son's poetry dangerous?" Another parent added, "Is the problem the music, or the fact that it's coming from voices you've ignored?" The walls were trembling now. The cracks were showing. Then came the tipping point. Kendrick announced the date for the first Voces da Escola showcase. It would take place in the school auditorium in 3 weeks. Every student was welcome to participate. Whitaker was livid. He stormed into her classroom the next morning. "You don't have my approval." "I don't need it," Kendrick replied. "The school charter supports student expression. You know that." His voice dropped to a hiss. "If you go through with this, you'll regret it." She stared him down. "I've regretted staying silent for years. I'm done with that." Whitaker left, slamming the door behind him. His grip on the school was slipping. And he knew it. But what he didn't know, what he couldn't know, was that outside his office, a revolution was already in motion. Because Elijah and the students of Lincoln High weren't just preparing for a performance. They were preparing for a reckoning. The next few days unfolded like the quiet before a thunderstorm. Everyone at Lincoln High could feel it, the electric tension, the charged anticipation pulsing through lockers, hallways, and classrooms. The posters for Voces da Escola reappeared almost as quickly as Whitaker had them torn down. The more he fought to control the narrative, the more it slipped through his fingers. In every corner of the school, students rehearsed. Voices once silenced now rang with conviction, raw, vulnerable, and unstoppable. Poetry, rap, dance, classical instruments, cultural stories. The program had become more than an event. It was a collective uprising wrapped in rhythm, rhyme, and grace. Whitaker, fuming in his office, tried everything. He pressured the superintendent. He reached out to a few loyal parents. He filed a formal complaint against Kendrick, accusing her of inciting unrest among the students. He called emergency meetings, citing safety concerns and lack of decorum. But for every attempt he made to crush the spirit of Voces da Escola, a dozen more students joined. The movement had outgrown its origin. In the midst of this, Elijah became something he'd never intended to be, a symbol. He was no longer just the scholarship kid who could play piano. He was the quiet voice who had stepped into the spotlight and, without saying a word, demanded to be heard. And others followed. Connor, once the cruelest voice in the room, watched from the sidelines. The guilt weighed heavier than he cared to admit. He had laughed, mocked, filmed. But now, every time Elijah passed him in the hallway, something twisted in his chest. It came to a head one afternoon when Elijah was sitting under the big oak tree in the courtyard, sheet music in his lap. Connor approached slowly, hands stuffed in his pockets, eyes down. "Hey," he muttered. Elijah looked up but said nothing. I was a jerk," Connor admitted, shifting awkwardly. "I thought it was funny. I didn't think. He trailed off. Silence. Then Elijah gave a small nod. Not forgiveness, not yet, but acknowledgement. The first step. Connor sat on the grass beside him. "You were amazing. That night." "Thanks." After a pause, Connor added, "I've been writing some stuff. Lyrics mostly. I don't know if it's any good." Elijah looked over. "You should share it." "Even after all that?" "Everyone's got something to say," Elijah replied quietly. "Doesn't matter where you start. It's where you go next." That moment, unnoticed by the rest of the school, was a quiet miracle. Proof that even those who had once laughed could learn to listen, and maybe change. But not all shifts were peaceful. 3 days before the performance, Whitaker made his boldest move yet. He called a full faculty assembly and announced, with cold certainty, that the Voces da Escola showcase was officially cancelled. Effective immediately. He cited safety risks, scheduling conflicts, lack of professional oversight. Kendrick's jaw clenched, her hands balled into fists. The students weren't present, but news traveled fast. By the time the final bell rang, a storm had erupted. Angry voices echoed in the hallways. Crumpled programs littered the floor. Students filled Kendrick's classroom to capacity, many of them in tears. "We can't let him win," someone whispered. "This was our only chance," said another. Elijah stood at the front of the room, quiet. The walls felt like they were closing in, but not on him. On the lies, the fear, the silence that had suffocated Lincoln High for too long. He looked at Kendrick. She met his eyes and gave the faintest nod. "Then we don't do it in the auditorium," Elijah said firmly. "We do it outside." The room went still. "You mean, like a protest?" Miguel asked. "No," Elijah said, voice strong now. "Like a concert. Like a movement. We turn the schoolyard into a stage. No spotlights. No velvet curtains. Just us. Our voices. Our truth." Jenny stood. "We'll need equipment." "I'll bring the soundboard," said a tall boy from the AV club. "My mom owns a bakery," another girl said. "She'll bring food. She supports everything we're doing." Hands shot up. Ideas spilled out. The room, moments ago sunken in defeat, now pulsed with hope. By the end of the day they had a plan. Flyers were made. Equipment secured. Volunteers organized. The schoolyard would become their stage. Whitaker tried to stop it. Of course he did. He called security. Threatened suspensions. Filed another complaint with the district. But something had shifted even among the adults. Parents who had once been silent now wrote letters in support. Alumni voiced outrage online. Teachers once too afraid to speak began to whisper words of encouragement in the hallways. The tide had turned. The day of the outdoor performance arrived like prophecy. The sky was a clean, endless blue. Chairs were set. Banners unfurled. A makeshift stage stood tall in the grass, humble but powerful. Students came. Teachers. Parents. Neighbors. And at the center of it all stood Elijah, nervous, yes, but unshakable. The moment his name was called, the crowd erupted. Not because of expectation. Because of belief. Elijah sat at the piano, the same one that had been wheeled out on a dolly from the music room. He ran his fingers across the keys, inhaled deeply, and began to play. The music soared, bolder, richer, more alive than ever before. It wasn't just a performance. It was testimony. Resistance. A promise. By the final note, the schoolyard had fallen completely silent. Then, a roar of applause. Tears. Cheers. Laughter. It was no longer just a school event. It was a revolution. The applause lasted so long it seemed to blur time. Some parents wiped their eyes. Others clapped until their hands stung. Students who had once passed Elijah like he didn't exist now surged forward to shake his hand, hug him, or simply whisper thank you. The transformation was complete, not just in the schoolyard but in the hearts of those watching. And Principal Whitaker? He stood at the far edge of the gathering, arms crossed, jaw locked. His usual polished smile was gone, replaced by a pale, rattled expression. He had tried everything, mockery, bureaucracy, manipulation, and still, here was the boy he'd aimed to humiliate, standing tall in the light of a community that had finally opened its eyes. His control was unraveling in real time. Later that evening the videos went viral. Clips from Elijah's performance at the outdoor Voces da Escola event flooded social media. The caption, "The boy they tried to silence," trended regionally within hours. Local news outlets picked it up. Community leaders began to take notice. A local arts magazine even dubbed Elijah, the soul of the school. By Monday morning, Lincoln High was no longer the school it had been just a month before. But even as Elijah walked into the building greeted by nods, smiles, and encouragement, he knew the real change hadn't fully arrived. Not yet. A performance, no matter how powerful, couldn't erase years of silence, nor could it remove the man still sitting in the principal's office. Whitaker wasn't finished. In his office, Whitaker drafted a formal disciplinary warning against Miss Kendrick, citing unauthorized student-led protests and deliberate defiance of administrative orders. He sent copies to the school board and began lobbying behind the scenes to replace her under the pretense of restoring order. But this time, Kendrick didn't stand alone. A coalition of parents, teachers, and even alumni had begun collecting testimony, letters, statements, and evidence of Whitaker's long-standing pattern of discrimination and suppression. Some parents wrote about how their children had been denied scholarships without cause. Others revealed how promising students were blocked from leadership roles or awards simply because they didn't fit the image. Kendrick herself had quietly compiled a detailed dossier, copies of altered evaluations, internal emails, secret meetings, and notes from past teacher complaints, all pointing to a systemic attempt to gatekeep Lincoln High's identity, to preserve it for the few at the cost of the many. At the heart of it all was Elijah's performance, which had cracked the facade wide open. That Friday, a group of parents marched into the office of the regional education superintendent and dropped the file on his desk. "We want an investigation," they said. Now. The story caught fire. A respected journalist from a major newspaper requested an interview with Kendrick and Elijah. An education rights organization offered legal resources to families who felt their children had been wrongfully excluded. The school board scheduled an emergency meeting, set for the following Tuesday. The walls were no longer cracking. They were collapsing. On the day of the meeting, the auditorium was packed. Teachers filled the first rows. Students lined the walls. Parents stood in the back. At the center sat Elijah and Kendrick, side by side, quiet but unshaken. Whitaker entered through the side door, escorted by two board members. His suit was sharp but his expression brittle. He looked around at the sea of faces, many of which used to admire him, and now stared with thinly veiled contempt. He gave a brief statement, one laced with well-practiced charm and strategic apologies. He denied any wrongdoing, dismissed accusations as misinterpretations, and framed the Voces da Escola movement as a well-intentioned but mismanaged event. Then Kendrick stood. She didn't speak with anger or vengeance. She simply laid out the facts, the pattern, the silenced names, the altered grades, the lies. And when she finished, she turned to Elijah and said, "Would you like to speak?" Elijah took a breath. He stood slowly and walked to the microphone. At first the words came slowly, but then they flowed like a melody he had played 100 times before. "I came here because someone believed in me. And for weeks I was told, without ever being directly told, that I didn't belong. I was made into a joke. But I didn't quit. Because I knew my worth. And I knew that behind every kid like me, there's a story worth hearing." He paused. "This school says it values excellence. But what good is excellence if it's only allowed for a few? We can't grow if we silence the very voices that make us different. That make us real." The room was silent. Then applause. Roaring. Sustained. Some board members even rose to their feet. Whitaker, seated stiffly, couldn't meet Elijah's eyes. That night, the board voted unanimously to suspend Principal Whitaker pending a formal investigation. An interim principal would be appointed. And to no one's surprise, that interim principal was Miss Kendrick. Elijah didn't celebrate like the others did. He walked home quietly, his steps slow, his thoughts heavy. It wasn't joy he felt. It was justice. Hard-earned. Long overdue. At home, Marta met him at the door. She didn't ask how it went. She could see it in his face. Instead, she wrapped him in her arms and whispered, "I told you, baby. Let them hear you." News of Principal Whitaker's suspension spread beyond Lincoln High with the same velocity as Elijah's music. By the weekend, it had been picked up by multiple local outlets, some even national. The headlines ranged from "Prestigious School Faces Reckoning After Students' Performance Sparks Uprising" to "Piano Prodigy Shakes a System Built on Silence." Elijah found himself at the center of a movement he hadn't planned to lead, his face and story shared far and wide. People recognized him on the street. Some stopped him just to say they were proud of him. It felt surreal, like stepping through a mirror into a world where his voice actually mattered. But for Elijah, the real victory wasn't in the press or the attention. It was in the quiet changes taking root at Lincoln High. Classrooms began to shift. Teachers who once ignored certain students now asked more questions, listened more carefully. The cafeteria, once a stage for silent social war, grew louder with laughter, new groups forming across the boundaries that had once seemed so concrete. Clubs began to open their doors wider. Students like Miguel and Jenny, once on the fringes, now led group discussions on diversity, inclusion, and opportunity. Most powerful of all, the Voces da Escola event was officially adopted as an annual celebration by the new administration. But this time it wasn't just a show. It became a school-wide initiative, A week dedicated to honoring every student's unique background through music, art, storytelling, and culture. It was real, it was permanent, and it bore Elijah's fingerprints in every corner. Meanwhile, Miss Kendrick's promotion to interim principal brought about immediate, tangible reform. The school's scholarship criteria were re-evaluated and expanded. A new committee, diverse, student-led, and transparent, was established to handle student performance events and extracurricular representation. Teacher evaluations became public and accessible. What once operated in the shadows was now under the light. But change wasn't just happening inside the school. It was happening inside Elijah. One evening, about a week after the board's decision, he received an envelope. The return address was embossed in gold, the National Conservatory of Performing Arts. He stared at it for a long time before opening it. Inside was an official letter. A full scholarship. Invitation to the upcoming spring term. Admission based not just on talent but on character. They had seen his story. They had watched his performance. He sat down slowly, heart pounding. Marta stood beside him, one hand on his shoulder. "You earned it," she said softly. Every note. Every bruise. Every sleepless night. Tears welled in Elijah's eyes, but they didn't fall. Not yet. Instead, he nodded, a deep, steady motion that said, "I'm ready." The next day, Elijah stood before his peers to make the announcement. The auditorium was full again, this time with smiles instead of suspicion. "I'm leaving in a few months," he told them. "But I'm not really going anywhere." He looked out over the crowd, faces he once feared, faces that had mocked him, ignored him, but now listened with genuine care. "I'll carry this place with me, everything we've done together. The music we made. The truth we spoke. The walls we tore down." He paused, his voice softening. "And I hope, when you hear someone being laughed at, you remember what it cost to stop the laughing. And choose to listen instead." The crowd stood again, clapping not just for a performance, but for a person. That night, Elijah went home and sat at the old piano. He didn't practice. He just played. Not for an audience. Not for approval. But because it was his language. His truth. And now, finally, the world had learned to understand it. Outside the window, the city lights blinked quietly. Inside, Marta watched from her rocking chair, smiling through eyes damp with pride. The keys danced beneath Elijah's fingers, and the house filled with the kind of music that said more than words ever could. "I'm still here. I made it. And I'm just getting started." Spring came to Eastwood with the smell of blooming jasmine and the distant echo of Elijah's music wafting from the small house on the corner of Rosemont and 8th. The same cracked sidewalks and crooked fences remained, but inside the Turner home, everything had changed. Letters arrived almost daily now, some from fans, others from students across the country who had seen the video of Elijah's performance and written to say thank you. One note, scribbled in blue crayon on lined paper, read, "I was scared to speak in class. But I saw your video. Now I believe I can." Elijah kept every letter, folded them gently, slipped them into a shoebox beneath his bed. The scholarship to the National Conservatory had turned his world upside down, but he walked through the changes with quiet steadiness. He still practiced each night on the old basement piano, still helped Marta hang laundry on weekends, still walked to Lincoln High not just as a student but as a symbol. With Whitaker gone, Kendrick's interim principalship brought a breath of new life into the school. She worked late into the evenings, rewriting policy, meeting with parents, ensuring that no child, regardless of income, skin color, or background, would ever again be invisible in her halls. One Friday morning she called Elijah into her office. Unlike Whitaker's, hers had plants on the windowsill, framed student art on the walls, and sunlight instead of shadows. "I have a favor to ask," she said with a small smile. "Sure," Elijah replied. "I want you to speak at graduation." He froze. "Me?" "Yes." The board approved it unanimously. He hesitated. I'm not a speaker. You are now." Elijah laughed softly, but a flicker of nerves passed through him. Performing music was one thing, pouring out his soul in silence. Speaking words? That was different. But he agreed. And when the day came, bright, warm, electric with expectation, he stood in front of hundreds. Dressed in a plain suit, fingers twitching slightly, heart steady. Marta sat in the front row, a new dress made by a neighbor, a camera in her lap. He stepped to the podium. "Not long ago," Elijah began, voice quiet but clear, "I sat in the back of this school, wondering if anyone would ever see me." A hush fell over the crowd. "I was laughed at, ignored, made to feel like I didn't matter. But I kept playing. Because I believed that music could say what I couldn't. He glanced down at his speech, then folded it and set it aside. I don't need this, he said, smiling, because I'm not just speaking for me. I'm speaking for every student who's ever felt like their voice was too small. For every kid who's been called a joke. For every person who thought they had to change to fit in here. He looked directly at the crowd. We don't need to be fixed. We need to be heard. The auditorium erupted, not just with applause but with something deeper. Understanding. Gratitude. A collective realization that they had witnessed a transformation not only of a student but of a school. Later that evening, as the sun dipped below the rooftops of Eastwood, Elijah walked home with Marta beside him. Neither said much. Words didn't fit the moment. The wind blew softly. The streetlights blinked on. Back home, Marta sat in her chair, shoes off, rubbing her ankles. You know, she said with a tired smile, when your mama was sick, I used to pray. Not for money. Not for miracles. Just for you. Elijah looked at her. For you to find a place in the world where people saw you the way I do. He swallowed hard. I think I found it. She nodded. Yes, baby. And you built it yourself. They didn't talk about Whitaker. About the investigation still ongoing. About the board's deliberations or the whispers of permanent leadership changes. That part of the story had already written itself. This part, the music, the movement, the meaning, was Elijah's. That night he sat down at the piano again. The old keys were a little stiffer now, the pedals creaky, the wood chipped along the edges. But the sound? Still full. Still fire. Still home. Summer arrived like a soft exhale after a long, breathless climb. The school year had ended, but the reverberations of what had happened at Lincoln High still rang through the community. In grocery store lines, at barbershops, in church pews, people spoke of it not just as a school story but as a turning point. The name Elijah Turner had become synonymous with courage. At the final school board meeting before summer recess, it was announced that Miss Kendrick would officially be installed as the new principal of Lincoln High. The news brought cheers from students and teachers alike. No one had to ask who her first pick was to speak at the press event that followed. Elijah declined gently. Not out of fear but clarity. I've said everything I needed to say, he told her with a quiet smile. It's time for the others to speak now. He chose, instead, to spend his final weeks before leaving for the National Conservatory preparing. Not just musically but spiritually, emotionally. He knew this next chapter would be different. Bigger. Demanding in ways he couldn't yet imagine. But for the first time in his life he didn't doubt whether he belonged. He knew he did. The last week in Eastwood was filled with goodbyes and quiet gifts. A group of neighbors pooled money to buy him a new travel case for his music books. Miguel gave him a worn notebook filled with math puzzles and poems. Jenny wrote a heartfelt letter. Even Connor came by with a rare show of humility and friendship, offering to help Elijah pack, sharing a few laughs and even awkwardly admitting, "You made me rethink everything." The night before his departure, Elijah sat one last time at the basement piano. Marta stood in the doorway, watching with that same loving patience she'd given him since he was a toddler, pounding on the keys with sticky fingers. He played not to rehearse but to remember. Each note was a step backward through time. The smell of Marta's cooking upstairs, the chill of winter mornings before school, the ache of isolation, the sting of Whitaker's words, and then, the sound of applause. The last chord lingered longer than any before it. When it faded, Elijah rested his hands on his knees and turned to Marta. "I'm scared," he admitted softly. "That means you're ready," she replied, walking to him. "If you weren't scared, it wouldn't matter enough." She hugged him then, long, tight, with the kind of embrace that anchors your soul and lets it fly at the same time. "You carry all of us with you," she whispered. "And no matter where you go, remember who taught you your first song." He nodded, eyes glassy. "I remember every note." The next morning, a crowd gathered at the bus station. Friends, neighbors, teachers, students, Marta. All of them there not to say goodbye but to send him forward. As the bus pulled up, Elijah slung the worn backpack over his shoulder, now patched but proud, and turned to face them. "Thank you," he said, "for listening." He boarded the bus, took a window seat, and as the wheels began to turn, he looked out to see Marta smiling, hand raised in farewell. She didn't wave. She saluted. That image stayed with him the whole ride. In the months that followed, Elijah thrived at the conservatory. He studied under some of the most respected instructors in the world, played in grand halls, won competitions, wrote original compositions that blended jazz, classical, and gospel in ways that made critics pause and listeners weep. But what made him special was never just the music. It was what he represented. He became a guest speaker at conferences, a featured performer at social justice fundraisers, and eventually, a founder of a nonprofit that offered free music education to underserved communities. Years later, when he returned to Lincoln High to perform at the 5th annual Voces da Escola celebration, the school had changed completely. Students of every background stood on stage together. The auditorium overflowed. And Kendrick, now district superintendent, greeted him like family. He sat at a new grand piano, one the school had purchased through community donations. The plaque beside it read, "In honor of Elijah Turner. Because everyone deserves to be heard." He played. And as the final notes soared and settled into silence, a standing ovation rose like thunder. Elijah stood, bowed once, and whispered to himself, "Let them hear you." He had. And they did. And the world would never be the same again. Elijah Turner's journey from silence to symphony is a reminder that true power isn't in volume, it's in conviction. That every person, no matter how overlooked, carries a voice worthy of being heard. His story speaks to the resilience of the human spirit, the power of courage, and the beauty of transformation born from truth. You don't have to be loud to be powerful, you just have to be honest. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channel for more stories that inspire, uplift, and challenge the world to become better, one voice at a time. Tell us in the comments, what's your story?